30 riders tried. 30 of the county's best. They came with braided leather quirts that whistled through the air, with silver-studded saddles and spurs that shone like cruel stars. They came with reputations forged in dust and grit, names that were spoken with respect at every rodeo and auction from here to the territories. And one by one, the great black horse sent them into the dirt. He was a creature born of midnight and fury, a stallion so large his shadow seemed to have its own weight. They called him Obsidian, for he was dark, hard, and sharp enough to cut you. The corral was a thunderdome of snorting rage. Hooves like polished stone struck the fence posts, splintering wood that had stood for 50 years. His eyes were boiling oil in a drum, and his manner was a storm cloud tangled with burrs and rage. The first cowgirl, a champion from out west, lasted 7 seconds before she was thrown so high her hat stayed in the air a moment after she landed. The 10th, a wiry woman with knuckles like walnuts, managed to get a rope over his neck, and he dragged her through the mud until the rope snapped like old twine. By the 30th, the attempts had become less about breaking the horse and more about surviving him. The crowd, once cheering for a show, now watched with a kind of grim fascination, convinced they were witnessing not a wild animal, but a demon given flesh and bone. On the edge of it all, leaning against a rickety wagon wheel that the world had forgotten, stood Silas. He was a man built soft and round, a man whose presence was usually a source of quiet mockery. The town saw a failure, a man who had let himself go, his frame a testament to surrender. They didn't see the history in his hands or the landscape of loss in his eyes. He watched the chaos, the whips, the spurs, the shouting. He saw the pride of the riders and the terror of the horse, and in the swirling dust, he recognized a pain that was achingly familiar. The last rider limped away, her face a mask of dust and humiliation. A silence fell over the crowd, broken only by Obsidian's ragged breathing as he circled the center of the corral, a lone, dark planet in his own violent orbit. The owner of the ranch, a hard-faced man named Thorn, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "That's it," he declared, his voice cutting. "Thing's poison. Sheriff, I want a writ. Putting him down tomorrow at sunrise." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the onlookers. It was a shame, a waste of powerful horse flesh, but what else could be done? A beast that couldn't be broken was a beast that couldn't be trusted. Sheriff Miller, a man whose tired face showed the weight of his badge, sighed and pulled out a small notepad. "It's your property, Jed." "A shame, but I see your point." From the edge of the crowd, a low voice rumbled, quiet but clear. Don't heads turned. It was Silas. He pushed himself off the wagon wheel, his movement slow and deliberate, drawing every eye. He looked at Thorn, then at the sheriff. "Don't hurt him." He's just scared." A wave of snickers and outright laughter rolled through the people. Jed Thorn turned, a look of utter disbelief on his face. "What did you say, Silas?" he sneered, making a show of it for the crowd. "You think you can do what 30 of the best couldn't? You'll be a puddle of jam before you take 2 steps." The laughter grew louder. "Go home, Silas," someone yelled. "You'll scare him with your shadow." But Silas's gaze didn't waver. He looked past Thorn, his eyes fixed on the heaving, trembling flank of the black stallion. "I'll try," he said, the word simple, without boast or bluster. Sheriff Miller looked from Jed's mocking face to Silas's strange calm. Maybe it was pity, or maybe it was just a weariness with all the violence. "Let him try, Jed," the sheriff said. "What's the harm? Cheaper than a bullet." Jed Thorn grinned, a malicious, calculating glint in his eye. He saw an opportunity not just for sport, but for ultimate humiliation. "All right, Sheriff." "All right," he announced, playing to the crowd. "Let the big man have his go. But if he's gonna prove something, let's make it a real test." He gestured for the corral gate to be unlatched. Silas didn't wait for another invitation. He walked past the smirking faces, ignoring the whispers that followed him like biting flies. He carried no rope, no bridle, no whip. His hands were empty. As he slipped through the gate, closing it softly behind him, a hush fell. The air, which moments before had been thick with aggression and jeers, now felt thin and electric with anticipation. Obsidian saw him. The horse's head snapped up, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring. He let out a piercing squeal and stomped a hoof, expecting the charge, the pain, the fight. But Silas just stood there, about 30 feet away, his body relaxed, his gaze soft. He didn't stare the horse down. He looked slightly away, a sign of peace, not challenge. "Easy now, son," Silas murmured, his voice a low thrum, barely audible to the crowd. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you anymore." The horse paused its frantic circling. It stood, quivering, watching this strange, quiet man. Silas took a slow, deliberate step. Then another. He moved not like a conqueror, but like a man asking permission to share the same patch of earth. He kept talking, his words a gentle stream of nonsense and comfort. He spoke of cool water and green pastures, of the feeling of sun on a dusty coat. He wasn't breaking a horse. He was calming a storm. After a minute that felt like an hour, Silas was close enough to reach out. Slowly, he extended a hand, palm open and down. Obsidian snorted, a gust of hot air, but he didn't bolt. He watched the hand, his great, dark eye reflecting the round man and the wide sky. Then, cautiously, he stretched his neck and touched his nose to Silas's fingers. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a fragile truce, a moment of impossible connection. Jed Thorne's face had curdled from mockery to disbelief, and now to a deep, simmering resentment. This quiet victory was an insult to everything he stood for. It made his methods, the town's methods, look not just ineffective, but brutish and ignorant. He couldn't let it stand. He strode to the fence, his boots crunching in the dirt. "A parlor trick," he boomed, shattering the spell. "Getting a horse to eat out of your hand ain't taming it. A real horse, a real rider, they're tested by the land, not by a gentle touch in a pen." He pointed a rigid finger towards the jagged mountains that loomed over the valley. "You want to prove that thing is tamed? You want to prove you're a horseman? Then you ride him. You ride him up the Widow's Ridge." The name fell into the crowd like a stone into a well. The Widow's Ridge. It was a name spoken in whispers, a local legend of lethality. A narrow, crumbling spine of rock that climbed a sheer cliff face, a path so treacherous it hadn't been ridden in a generation, not since it had claimed the life of a rancher and his mount. It was a test of nerve, balance, and above all, a horse's complete trust in its rider, and a rider's absolute control over his horse. It wasn't a race, it was a verdict. The crowd was silent now, the jeers replaced by a sharp intake of breath. This wasn't sport anymore. This was a death sentence offered as a challenge. The sheriff stepped forward. "Now hold on, Jed. That's not a challenge, that's a fool's errand." Jed ignored him, his eyes locked on Silas. "That's the deal. Ride the ridge, and the horse is yours. Fail. And we all know how that story ends." He was so certain of the outcome. Silas stood beside Obsidian, one hand now resting gently on the horse's powerful neck. He looked from the frightened, magnificent animal beside him to the cruel, jagged line of the ridge against the sky. He felt the horse's life thrumming beneath his palm, a life as misjudged and cornered as his own. He turned his head slowly and met Jed's hateful gaze. "We'll ride," Silas said, and the two words sealed a pact with the mountain itself. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving the valley in shades of bruised purple and grey. The townspeople dispersed, their minds buzzing with the grim spectacle promised for the morning. They left Silas alone in the vast, silent corral with the giant black horse. Night fell completely, deep and star-pricked. Under the milky sweep of the heavens, Silas didn't try to saddle Obsidian. He didn't force a bit into his mouth or try to practice turns. Instead, he brought a bucket of fresh, cool water and held it steady as the big horse drank, long and deep. He brought a curry comb, its teeth worn smooth from a lifetime of use, and began to work on the tangled, matted mane. His movements were patient, rhythmic. With every pass of the comb, he wasn't just removing burrs, he was unraveling knots of fear. He spoke to the horse the whole time, his voice a constant, soothing presence in the dark. He didn't tell the horse what to do. He told him his own story, in fragments and murmurs. He spoke of a small farm, of a gentle wife with laughter in her eyes, of another horse, a graceful mare named Willow. Obsidian stood still, a colossal statue of listening stillness. The horse, who had met every other human with explosive violence, now rested his heavy head near Silas's shoulder, his breathing evening out into a soft, steady rhythm. Hours passed. Silas cleaned the horse's coat, checking his hooves for stones, his touch gentle and sure. This was not the preparation for a contest of dominance. It was a quiet conversation, a communion between two wounded souls who had been judged and found wanting by the world. In the profound silence of the night, a bond was being forged not of leather and steel, but of something far stronger, a shared understanding of pain and the quiet promise of trust. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern peaks, Silas finally brought out a simple, worn leather saddle. He didn't throw it on. He let Obsidian smell it, investigate it, before settling it on his back as gently as a blanket. As he cinched the saddle, the scent of old leather and horse sweat filled the air, and it threw a latch in Silas's memory. The world of the corral dissolved, replaced by another night, another storm. He was younger then, leaner, his face not yet softened by grief. Rain was lashing down, turning the farmyard into a sea of mud. Lightning cracked the sky open, and inside the barn, his mare, Willow, was screaming. She had been spooked by the thunder, had kicked through her stall, and was now trapped in a tangle of splintered wood and her own panic. He remembered the men from the neighboring ranch, good men with good intentions, shouting advice. "Rope her! Get her head down!" They saw a wild animal to be subdued. He saw his partner, his friend, terrified and in pain. They had thrown ropes, and she had fought harder, her beautiful legs scraping against the sharp wood. He had screamed at them to stop, to back away, but his voice was lost in the storm and their certainty. They believed force was the only language a panicked animal could understand. They were wrong. He remembered the final, awful crack of bone, and the silence that followed, a silence more terrible than any thunder. He remembered kneeling in the mud and straw beside her, her life slipping away under his helpless hands. His wife found him there hours later, soaked and broken, muttering the same words over and over. "I'm sorry. I should have made them listen." He had learned the hardest lesson of his life that night, that a creature's greatest fear cannot be broken, it can only be soothed. That true strength wasn't in the hand that held the whip, but in the one that offered stillness in the midst of terror. You don't fight a storm, you wait for it to pass. You don't fight fear, you show it there is nothing left to fear. He blinked, the memory receding, leaving the cold pre-dawn air sharp in his lungs. He looked at Obsidian, whose dark eye watched him with an unnerving intelligence. "You ain't a demon," Silas whispered, patting the strong neck. "You're a mirror." The town gathered at the foot of the mountain as if for a funeral. The air was cold and still, carrying every cough, every nervous shuffle of boots on gravel. Jed Thorne stood near the trailhead, arms crossed, the picture of smug authority. He had his own horse with him, a muscular roan, saddled and ready. "In case you need someone to retrieve the body," he'd said to the sheriff, loud enough for all to hear. Then they came. Silas, walking slowly, leading Obsidian by a single, loose rein. The man and the horse moved as one, a single, dark shape against the growing light. There were no more jeers. The sight of them, the quiet man and the immense, calm beast, was too strange, too unnerving for mockery. They looked less like a rider and his mount and more like two pilgrims beginning a solemn journey. Silas didn't look at the crowd. His focus was entirely on the horse and the mountain. He paused at the trailhead, the beginning of the infamous ridge path, which snaked upward into the sky like a jagged scar. He leaned forward and spoke into Obsidian's ear, his words for the horse alone. Then, with a smoothness that defied his size, he swung himself into the saddle. He gathered the reins, but held them lightly, a suggestion rather than a command. He nudged Obsidian with his heels, a gentle press. For a moment, nothing happened. The horse stood, tasting the air, his gaze fixed on the brutal ascent ahead. The crowd held its breath. Then, Obsidian took a step. And another. He began to climb. The path was steep from the outset, littered with loose scree. A horse bred for speed would fight it, would try to rush it and lose its footing. But Obsidian moved with a slow, powerful deliberation, placing each hoof with the care of a mountain goat, his great muscles bunching and releasing in a steady, relentless rhythm. Silas sat tall, a calm center in the saddle, his body moving with the horse, not against it. He was not a passenger, he was a partner in the climb. Higher they went, shrinking to a silhouette against the pale rock face. The people below craned their necks, their faces a mixture of dread and wonder. The Widow's Ridge was even more treacherous up close than it appeared from the valley. It narrowed in places to barely the width of a horse, with a sheer drop of hundreds of feet on one side. The wind picked up, a low moan that seemed to emanate from the rock itself, trying to push them from their precarious perch. They reached the knife edge, the most feared section of the path. Here, a past rockslide had taken a huge bite out of the trail, leaving a crumbling, unstable ledge. This was where the last rider had fallen. Obsidian stopped. He lowered his head, sniffing the treacherous ground. He took a hesitant step, and a cascade of small stones skittered over the edge, disappearing into the abyss. A collective gasp rose from the crowd below. This was the moment of truth. Any other rider would have used spurs and whip, forcing the horse across through sheer will and terror. They would have tried to conquer the horse's fear. Silas did the opposite. He loosened the reins even more, giving the horse his head completely. He leaned forward, his weight a steadying presence, and murmured, "I'm with you." You know the way he put his trust not in his own control, but in the instincts of the animal beneath him. He trusted the horse to save them both. Obsidian stood for a long, tense moment, his muscles trembling. Then, with an intelligence that seemed almost human, he tested the ground again, shifted his weight to his powerful hindquarters, and with a series of careful, precise steps, he navigated the broken path. He did not rush. He did not panic. He moved with the mountain, not against it. Silas did not steer. He simply trusted. From the valley floor, it was a miracle, a silent ballet of courage and faith played out against the sky. The descent was just as perilous, but the pact was sealed. Man and horse moved with a shared mind, a single heartbeat. They emerged from the shadow of the mountain into the full morning sun, not with the frantic energy of a victory, but with the quiet dignity of a trial endured and passed. Obsidian was not lathered in sweat from fear, but shone with the honest sheen of effort. Silas dismounted, his movements stiff but steady. He didn't raise a fist in triumph. He didn't look to the crowd for applause. He simply turned to the great black horse and laid his forehead against Obsidian's, closing his eyes for a long moment. A silence, profound and absolute, lay over the valley. It was a silence filled with shattered pride and dawning respect. The sound of over 100 people forgetting to breathe. Jed Thorne stood frozen, his smug certainty washed away, leaving his face slack with shock. The roan at his side shifted nervously, sensing its master's world tipping on its axis. He had set a test to prove force was king, and instead had staged a coronation for empathy. He had wanted to see a man broken, and had instead witnessed a man made whole. There was no cheer. No one shouted. The spectacle they had come for had been replaced by something holy, something they didn't have words for. Silas finally turned from the horse and began to walk, leading Obsidian by the loose rein, heading not towards the crowd, but towards his own small, neglected home on the edge of town. As he passed, the people didn't just step aside. They parted, creating a wide, respectful path, their eyes following him with an awe they usually reserved for thunderstorms and miracles. Pride shattered. Ego humbled. A legend born. In the days that followed, the story settled over the town like a quiet, cleansing rain. The legend of the Widow's Ridge was rewritten. It was no longer a story about a place of death, but a place of trust. The name Silas was no longer a synonym for failure. It was spoken with a kind of hushed reverence. The change was not in grand apologies, but in small, silent gestures. The storekeeper who had once overcharged him now saved him the best cuts of bacon. The children who had mocked his size now watched from a distance, their eyes wide with wonder. One morning, Silas found a brand new, expertly braided leather bridle hanging on his fence post, a silent offering from a man who didn't have the words to say he was wrong. Jed Thorne was never seen at the saloon bragging again. He became a quieter man, his certainty replaced by a thoughtful shadow. Silas and Obsidian were a fixture now, a landmark of the valley. They would ride out, not to conquer trails, but simply to move across the land, two companions content in each other's presence. One afternoon, a group of children followed him to the corral. The boldest among them, a small girl with a freckled nose, held out a wrinkled apple. "Is it for him?" Silas asked, his voice gentle. The girl nodded, too shy to speak. Silas didn't take the apple. Instead, he knelt down, bringing himself to her level. "You give it to him," he said. "Just hold your hand out flat. Let him know he can trust you." He watched as the girl, trembling slightly, offered the apple to the great black horse. Obsidian lowered his massive head and took the fruit with lips as soft as velvet. The girl's face broke into a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. Silas smiled too, a real smile that reached his eyes. He wasn't a horse breaker. He was a teacher of trust, a keeper of quiet strength, a man who had shown a town full of fighters that the greatest power on earth was not in the reins, but in the open, gentle hand.